The deaths of American presidents mirrors the complexity of history, filled with tragedy, mystery, and even strange turns. From shocking assassinations to untimely illnesses, each story ends in its own extraordinary way. On December 14, 1799, Washington, the hero of the Revolution and the nation's first president, awoke with a sore throat. Over the next day, it worsened terribly, leaving him unable to breathe or swallow. His doctors tried a cure, bloodletting, which was meant to remove nearly 5 pints, but only weakened him more. According to reports, he stayed calm, instructing his affairs in his last hours, and his last words were, "'Tis well." Washington's death shook the young nation, but the irony didn't escape historians. The man, who braved war and icy rivers, was felled by what today might have been cured by antibiotics. Adams's final moments came with poetic timing. Exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1826. At 90, Adams had seen the highs of founding the U.S. and the lows of losing re-election to his frenemy, Jefferson. That summer, as his health failed, Adams muttered, "Thomas Jefferson's survives." It was ironic that Jefferson had died just hours earlier, proof that their rivalry had staying power even in death. Adams, who was known for his gruff demeanor and a pivotal role in securing independence, died at the end of an era. He will be remembered for the Alien and Sedition Acts and the creation of the United States Navy. And yes, he left us wondering, was that last remark an olive branch or one last jab at Jefferson? Jefferson lived to see the 50th anniversary of his most famous work, the Declaration of Independence, but not much longer. The 83-year-old passed away at Monticello, his beloved Virginia estate, on July 4, 1826. Jefferson, who had been sick for years with a variety of illnesses, was reported to have asked before he died.
"It's the 4th.
Almost mythic was the coincidence of Adams dying the same day as he did. The Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition were part of Jefferson's presidency, but he is famously known for the Declaration, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and for founding the University of Virginia. Even his death had been carefully curated, always the intellectual. James Madison, the 4th president, spent his last days as a quiet statesman living at his Virginia estate. At 85, he was frail and in poor health. According to the story, Madison refused his breakfast, reportedly joking to his niece that he was only trying to wait for the 4th. He died on June 28, 1836, after uttering, "Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear." His last words were in response to his niece, who asked, "What is the matter?" Madison was never able to explain, so his family did not know what he meant, a mystery for the family to ponder. Sadly, the father of the Constitution didn't make it to July, as he died of heart failure. Madison was towering in his legacy, co-authoring the Federalist Papers and helping to shape the Constitution, but his death was muted compared to most of his peers. Later, his wife, Dolly, became one of the first Americans to publicize ice cream. That would have been better for Madison than his medicine of the time. The 3rd president to die on Independence Day was Monroe, the 5th president and namesake of the Monroe Doctrine, who died on July 4, 1831. Talk about a patriotic exit. He was 73 when he died from heart failure and tuberculosis. His last words were, "I regret that I should leave this world without again beholding him." Him being James Madison, one of his best friends. He is remembered for expanding United States territory through his acquisition of Florida. His 1820 re-election campaign was so nearly unanimous that one elector voted against him to preserve Washington's record. It's a humble way to go for the guy who secured America's foreign policy independence. John Quincy Adams' life was spent in service, negotiating pivotal treaties and serving as the 6th President of the United States. After his presidency, he became a staunch in the House of Representatives. Tragedy struck when Adams was 80, still engaged in another savage debate in Congress. While giving a heated speech, he suddenly died of a stroke. Just hours later, on February 23, 1848, he was carried away and passed in the Capitol building. His life's dedication to America was reflected in his death in the halls of Congress, the heart of American democracy. His last words were said to be, "This is the last of earth. I am content." The warrior president, Andrew Jackson, led the nation with a mixture of fiery passion and populist resolve. Jackson was known for his bold actions and the founding of the Democratic Party. His health had been frail for years, but it didn't stop him from fighting tough political battles. Jackson, at the age of 78, was living in retirement at his Hermitage estate in Tennessee as he neared the end of his life. His declining health was undeniable, and his final days had been spent with family. He died from a combination of chronic illnesses, including tuberculosis, on June 8, 1845. He reportedly said before his death that he wanted to be with his wife Rachel. In the end, his love for her remained a prominent part of his story. A man of refined political skills, Martin Van Buren had worked his way up the ladder of politics to become a major player in the early years of the American Republic. When he left office, he moved back to his home in Kinderhook, New York, where he lived out the rest of his life, musing on the tumult he had seen in the office. Although widely criticized for his handling of the Panic of 1837, Van Buren was loved in his community. He died, probably of pneumonia, at the age of 79 on July 24, 1862, after years of being sick. Van Buren's death was not as violent as many others of that era, but it was the end of influential political figures from the early 19th century. His final words, reportedly calm and reassuring, were, "There is no cause for any excitement about my death. I die just as I have lived, calmly and without fear." William Henry Harrison's presidency is notorious for its brevity, but his death is consummate history. When Harrison became the oldest president to date, elected in 1841, he took office on March 4th, after the frigid inauguration speech given without proper attire. Soon after that, his health faltered, and he died of pneumonia 31 days later. He became the shortest-serving president in American history because of this. His sudden death shocked the nation and exposed the fragility of the presidency. Harrison's death also established a precedent for presidential succession and raised the question of whether the office required physical strength. It also showed how quickly even the most experienced leader could be brought undone by illness. He passed away on April 4, 1841, but his legacy would be a symbol of the unexpected. John Tyler became the President of the United States in an unusual manner. He was the first vice president to become president due to the death of the president William Henry Harrison. His presidency was always controversial because Tyler's states' rights stand saw him at loggerheads with both parties. After the presidency, Tyler became an ardent supporter of the Confederation during the Civil War. This was his major contribution to American history in later years. Tyler died of a stroke at the age of 71 on the 18th of January in 1862 in his home in Richmond, Virginia. Although he made his inputs to the growth of the nation in his early years, Tyler was doing the opposite in his later years of supporting the South region, thus leaving a mixed legacy. His death was in a way obscured by war, but he played an important part in the development of the succession of presidency and diplomacy. James K. Polk was one of America's more ambitious presidents and the epitome of an expansionist. He has been attributed to the successful acquisition of Texas territory and the successful completion of the Mexican-American War that brought more territories into the United States. Nevertheless, Polk's ambitious nature to accomplish his objectives drained his physical energy by the time his presidential term was complete. In June 1849, only 3 months after leaving office, Polk, aged 53, dropped dead at his home in Nashville. He probably died from cholera, which was a common disease at that period. Polk's death came as a surprise to many people since he was such an active president a few months ago. His final words, according to some reports, were to his wife, Sarah. "I love you, Sarah," a touching end to a man who had prioritized his country over all else during his presidency. Zachary Taylor's death meant the conclusion of a short but rather vivid story of the United States presidency. Taylor was a military man who had come into office after fighting the Mexicans in the Mexican-American War, and he was optimistic about his presidency. However, in the year 1850, Taylor became sick after participating in a 4th of July event. He consumed fresh fruits without cooking them and took cold milk, which is believed to have caused acute gastroenteritis. After only 16 months of holding office, the poor fellow was taken seriously ill and died on July 9, 1850. His demise was shocking to everyone in the nation and made people realize how vulnerable leadership is. Taylor's death, while relatively swift, opened up a new phase in the politics of the 1850s. Millard Fillmore's death on the 8th of March in 1874 was as uneventful as his presidency had been. Nearing the age of 75, the candidate experienced a stroke and his health never quite improved. His final words when offered a spoonful of soup were reportedly, "The nourishment is palatable," a befitting end for one of the most low-key presidents that history has produced. Fillmore is most popular for having accepted the Compromise of 1850 to reduce tensions between the North and the South, but did not solve the problem of slavery. Nevertheless, Fillmore should be credited for bringing modernity to the White House with the first library, bathtub, and kitchen stove. At least he left the office with a full stomach and something to read. Franklin Pierce, the 14th president, did not enjoy a happy life once out of office. Failing to steer the United States through a rising sectional crisis, he mostly struggled with personal issues such as alcoholism in his later years. Pierce died on October 8th, the 1869 of cirrhosis of the liver at the age of 64. His passing was peaceful, an ignominious end to a presidency marred by controversy, including his backing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, thus furthering the already tense issue of slavery. Pierce's presidency is considered one of the worst, but his personal life was equally as disastrous. He lost all 3 children, one of which died in a train tragedy just weeks before the inauguration. His last years were lonely and filled with remorse, a fair lesson for rulers and a heads-up to those would-be leaders. James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States, who was frequently associated with his inactivity before the Civil War, died of respiratory failure at the age of 77 on June 1, 1868. Despite living to witness the reunification of the United States, his respect in society never rebuilt itself. Buchanan once claimed, "History will vindicate my memory," but spoiler alert, it hasn't. As noted for his weakness during the nation's most critical time, Buchanan spent his post-presidency life in Wheatland, his Pennsylvania home. Though his presidency was nothing to write home about, he spent his last years penning a book in justification for the things he did, or rather, the things he did not do. His death was not met with many tributes, but it is proper for a man whose leadership was as humble as it could be. President Abraham Lincoln's shooting on April 15, 1865, is among the most famous incidents that ever happened in America. Healing from the wound took place in the Peterson House next to the theater, and Lincoln died the next morning at the age of 56 from blood poisoning after being shot by actor John Wilkes Booth. He died embarrassingly right at the heels of the Union side's triumph in the Civil War. The last thing he could say before passing on, said eyewitnesses, was that he had had a dream of going to the city of Jerusalem. Tragically serene remark to make before dying in such a manner. Millions of people turned out to view Lincoln's funeral train after news of his assassination broke out. Famous for sustaining the Union and liberating the oppressed, his memory remains one of the greatest presidents of all time. The first president to be impeached, Andrew Johnson, died on July 31, 1875, by natural death, having suffered a stroke at the age of 66. He passed on while on a Christmas vacation in his daughter's home in Tennessee, away from the political warring that characterized his time in office. Johnson's record will always be one of lost chances, for his handling of Reconstruction and conflicts with Congress left the South after the Civilian War in turmoil. Johnson was a hard-headed and polarizing figure, and much of his post-presidency was spent attempting to re-establish political power, even going back to the Senate in 1875. Johnson is one of only 2 presidents with no formal education at all, a clear indication that sometimes sheer determination trumps knowledge, but not necessarily public approval. The hero of the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant, died from throat cancer on July 23, 1885, at the age of 63. He spent his last year penning his memoirs to support his family after the collapse of a business that cost him a fortune. However, Grant finished the memoirs a few days before the end of his life. He gained a reputation, and his family became financially secure. His presidency, which is remembered for Reconstruction and scandals, was overshadowed by his victory over the Confederacy as a general. Grant will be forever remembered for his tenacity in the face of a death sentence. His funeral remains one of the most massive in United States history. His death, as has been his entire life, was worthy of a hero, and one might add that he triumphed to the end. Retired from office, Hayes engaged himself in social causes and education reforms after he had ended the Reconstruction period. Hayes suffered a heart attack at his home in Fremont, Ohio at age 70 on the 17th of January in 1893. A second attack took him the following day. His last words were reportedly, "I know that I am going where Lucy is," referring to his beloved wife, who had died 4 years earlier. Hayes is best remembered for the disputed 1877 compromise which ensured his election but led to the removal of troops from the South, ending the post-war Black freedom. While he shunned the political limelight post-presidency, his support for public education brought out his silent contribution to the betterment of the country. James A. Garfield's presidency was tragically cut short by an assassin's bullet. He was shot by Charles Guiteau, an unemployed and bitter government seeker, on July 2, 1881, in a train station in Washington, D.C. It took him 79 agonizing days to die from infection on 19th of September 1881 at the age of 49. The premature death was probably caused by medical negligence and improper use of unsterilized instruments during the treatment of the wound. Garfield was in office for only about 6 months when he died, but he had a huge agenda for changing civil service. His death was tragic, and the loss led to advanced changes in medical procedures and provided better security for future presidents. His final lucid statement to his chief of staff before he lapsed back into a delirium was, "Oh, Swaim, can't you stop this?" It's a grim reminder that sometimes history is made in the twist of a moment or the absence of hand sanitizer, as was the case with Garfield. Chester A. Arthur succeeded to the presidency when Garfield died, but ironically, he also departed from office as a dying man. Living the last years of his life suffering from Bright's disease, a kidney illness, Arthur went into self-exile in New York City and out of the public limelight. On November 18, 1886, he died at the age of 57, 1 year after leaving the presidency. Arthur's work is generally unknown, but he stunned reformers by signing the Pendleton Act to reform the civil service, thus distancing himself from the political machine that put him in office. It was a shame that Arthur had only a short time in office, but even his decision to resist polarization is significant, though he was much more interested in wearing expensive suits than making speeches. Grover Cleveland, who was the only president to serve 2 terms of non-consecutive service, passed on the 24th of June, 1908, due to a heart attack at the age of 71 in his home in Princeton, New Jersey. Known for his blunt honesty, his reported last words were, "I have tried so hard to do right." Whatever the specifics of Cleveland's politics, his term in office came to be defined by his commitment to the principles of the gold standard and his vetoing of what he saw as unnecessary spending. Some of them are controversies. He had surgery to remove a cancerous growth in his mouth, performed in a yacht to ensure that he did not cause panic among the public. Cleveland was a president who preferred honesty to popularity, but even the most obstinate can't veto death. Benjamin Harrison, who succeeded his grandfather William Henry Harrison's legacy, died on March 13, 1901, at the age of 67. He succumbed to pneumonia, which he caught after being afflicted with influenza, a rather hazardous disease in the course of the epoch. Harrison's presidency was notable for his support of civil rights and the Sherman Antitrust Act, but his reserved demeanor earned him the nickname the Human Iceberg. He was buried without much fuss, as a man more inclined towards doing things than rhetoric. Notably, he also acted as the first president to bring electricity into the White House, though he never touched the light switches himself. This was proved even in his death. Harrison was still advising everyone to be careful of the dangers that exist in the world. William McKinley's life was cut short on September 14, 1901, when he was shot by an anarchist called Leon Czolgosz at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. At first thought to regain consciousness, McKinley succumbed to gangrene from his wounds and passed away after 8 days at age 58. His last words to his wife Ida were heartbreaking. "Goodbye all. Goodbye. It is God's way. His will be done." McKinley is best known for the Spanish-American War, which increased the American empire overseas, and for the protectionist policies. This made it the third time a president was assassinated, and the call for better security was made louder. His death put Theodore Roosevelt in the presidency and paved the way for a fresh period in American political history. The upstaging Roosevelt, who famously delivered a speech while suffering from a bullet through the chest, appeared to be invincible. But it was on January 6, 1919, that his heart ceased to beat. He was 60 years old. A man known for charging up hills and breaking political traditions, he had slowed down after the death of his youngest son Quentin in World War I. Vice President Thomas Marshall quipped upon hearing the news, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight." His legacy includes the Panama Canal, national parks, and the famous "speak softly and carry a big stick" foreign policy. The president's shadow was as imposing as the mountains he wanted to protect, even in death. The curtain finally fell on Taft on March 8, 1930, caused by a long-drawn ailment that had been progressively getting the better of him. He died in his Washington, D.C. residence and had been taken ill by heart disease and high blood pressure at the age of 72. Taft is the only president to serve as Supreme Court Chief Justice, and it was the position he preferred over his presidency. Although Taft is often the subject of jokes about his weight, yes, including the famous but apocryphal story about a stuck bathtub, he worked tirelessly to strengthen the judiciary. The presidential funeral was followed by burial at Arlington National Cemetery, thus making him the first president to be buried there. Some might say Taft's life shows that it's never too late to change direction, though hopefully not while stuck in a bathtub. Despite the fact that he led America through World War I, Wilson's final years were weakened by his health. He died on February 3, 1924, at 67 years old, about 3 years and 3 months after leaving the presidency. He had a stroke in 1919, leaving him partially crippled, and even today, Woodrow Wilson is remembered for his speeches and support of the League of Nations. Wilson was the first president to move to Washington. After leaving the presidency as a private citizen, however, he continued the peace symbol. His widow, Edith, was so protective of him during his incapacitation that some joked she was the first female president. Wilson's death marked the end of an era, but left behind a world still grappling with the reality of his dream for lasting peace. Just as Harding rose and became famous, he was also dead in the same manner. He suffered a heart attack on August 2, 1923, during a speaking tour of the West Coast in a San Francisco hotel room at age 57. At first, it was thought that he died of food poisoning or heart attack, but wherever Harding went, a scandal was not far behind. Some even think his wife Florence poisoned him in order to spare him further disgrace given the scandals such as the Teapot Dome. While he was good to the voters, historians acknowledge that his contributions were in the ability to fail. To some extent, one could argue that Harding was lucky to die when he did in order to spare him the further humiliation and setbacks that tarnished his associates' reputations. Silent Cal lived simply and died the same way. Coolidge suffered a heart attack on January 5, 1933, and died in his home in Northampton, Massachusetts. He was 60. Known for his dry wit and minimalistic approach to governance, Coolidge famously once said, "The business of America is business." His presidency during the Roaring Twenties was characterized by economic growth, but his critics suggested that he did not pay attention to the signs that the Great Depression was coming. Upon hearing of his death, writer Dorothy Parker allegedly quipped, "How can they tell?" In terms of his deeds and his contributions, Coolidge is also rather unobtrusive, though one can sense that he had quite a character. Hoover was lucky to live up to 90 years, which made him one of the oldest presidents at the time. After years of deteriorating health, he died in New York on the 20th of October 1964. Hoover will always be associated with the Great Depression in the United States, but after his presidency, he actively worked and served to build up his image again. A professional engineer with great business acumen, Hoover was better equipped to tackle technical issues rather than politics. Ironically, the man attributed to the greatest economic disaster in the history of America passed away more or less during the post-war prosperity, which looked like a somewhat grim joke on the American way of life. Roosevelt was ruling the world at the time his health problems began to manifest themselves. On April 12, 1945, when he was having his portrait taken in Warm Springs, Georgia, he reported that he had a headache and fainted. He died a few hours later from a massive cerebral hemorrhage, aged 63. The president who led America through the Great Depression and World War II was no more, not even half the year to the end of the war. His last words reportedly were, "I have a terrific headache." When Roosevelt died, the post-war world was left to Vice President Harry Truman. His death was a shock for a country that felt the man had become indispensable. Harry Truman, the president who brought World War II to an end and presided over the dawn of the atomic age, died at the age of 88. He passed on December 26, 1972, in Kansas City, Missouri, due to pneumonia complications. While he was alive, his presidency was seen as timid, and the public underestimated his accomplishments, such as the Marshall Plan and the integration of the armed forces. Truman famously said, "The buck stops here," and he stuck to that philosophy, even as his popularity fluctuated. After retirement, Truman lived a simple life and rejected a lot of big money-making opportunities related to his presidency. When asked why, he replied, "You don't want to commercialize the highest office in the land." The Supreme Allied Commander, and later the President of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower waged his last battle in 1969. Suffering from heart-related issues for years, he died at Walter Reed Army Medical Center on March 28, 1969, at the age of 78. His final words, as recorded, were full of gratitude for his family and friends. "I want to go. God take me." He was a great planner and architect who presided over the age of peace and plenty while handling the Cold War prudently. He also fought for the interstate highway system, which revolutionized infrastructure in America. Despite his military background, Eisenhower's farewell address famously warned of the military-industrial complex. Even in death, Eisenhower proved a pragmatic president who showed that a man could be popular and liked while at the same time providing firm and strong leadership. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy on the 22nd of November 1963 came as a rude shock to most people and a blow that America has never been able to heal. He was only 46 years old, riding in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas, when he was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. The young, charismatic president who emerged as the United States leader during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the man who put forward the idea of a man on the moon was killed in his prime. His assassination caused an outpour of grief across the nation, and the picture of his boy saluting his father's coffin touched the hearts of millions. The tragic presidency of Kennedy only spanned 1036 days, but his vision for the future paved the way for a brighter tomorrow. His final words were a casual reply to Texas Governor John Connally, "No, you certainly can't." President Lyndon B. Johnson left office for his ranch in Texas after the Vietnam War and civil protests, which affected his health. After 4 years out of office, he died from a heart attack on 22 January 1973 at the age of 64. Johnson was a titanic figure and propelled the Great Society. He supported civil rights, signing bills such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Nevertheless, his presidential years were marred by the morass of Vietnam. For his remaining years, he brooded over his record and, in an interview with a biographer, declared, "I've had more love, more sorrow, more joy, more pain than anyone I've ever known." His passing, one day after a Vietnam ceasefire was declared, was somewhat fittingly dramatic. Former President Richard Nixon died on 22 April 1994, aged about 81 years, after a stormy political career in the United States of America. Nixon's resignation makes him the only president of the United States to do so, and his presidency is most remembered for the Watergate scandal. However, his foreign policy is noteworthy. First was the opening up of relations with China, and second was détente with the Soviet Union. While Nixon was not able to fully return to government service after his presidency, he did spend time in the years after his resignation attempting to repair his image, writing books, and becoming sort of a folk hero statesman. His funeral was graced by all the presidents who were alive at the time, which was a clear indication of the fact that he lived a very eventful life that was both significant and convoluted. Gerald Ford, the man who restored trust in the presidency after Watergate, passed away on December 26, 2006 at age 93, making him the longest living president at the time. He died from cardiovascular problems in his home in Rancho Mirage, California. Ford, who famously pardoned President Nixon, a move that may have been politically exigent but certainly socially beneficial, made America whole again. His death was followed by both parties mourning, and he remains to this date an accidental but stable president. His constant performance reassured the public that sometimes consistency is what is needed. Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, left a profound mark on America, but faced a slow, heartbreaking decline in his final years. In 1994, Reagan announced he had Alzheimer's disease, and since then he retired from public life. He died of pneumonia-related illness at the age of 93 on the 5th of June 2004. Reagan's presidency is remembered for his charismatic leadership, economic policies, and ending the Cold War. He famously urged Gorbachev to tear down this wall. Honestly, his death caused a lot of sadness and a full week of mourning throughout the country. Despite the progressive demoralization of his last memories, Reagan left an indelible mark as a historic figure in the United States and the world. His ability to connect with the public was unparalleled, proof that sometimes a simple, "Well, there you go again," can win hearts. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below which president had the most interesting time in office.